In the earliest days of the United States' existence, gifts that were given to diplomats and politicians had to be declared before Congress, where a vote was held on whether or not that gift could be kept by its recipient. The reason? Gifts of any kind might influence the politician, deliberately or subconsciously, to favor the gift giver in the context of any government policy or action, thereby compromising the politician's loyalty to America and his constituents. Just a few days ago, South Dakota lawmakers struck down in a 27-8 vote a voter-approved initiative that would remove South Dakota's status as the only state that allowed lobbyists to give politicians unlimited and undisclosed gifts. The reason? The word gift used in the legislation was too broad, and limiting them in any way is akin to suppressing free speech. We have certainly fallen a long way down, and that long fall is detailed in the book that I just finished, Corruption in America by Zephyr Teachout. Teachout, a professor turned political activist and candidate, cares extensively about corruption. Many Americans care about corruption, but what makes her special, what makes her book special, is that she is an expert in both the law and history of corruption in the United States. In her book, she goes over both in great detail, tracing not just the evolution of corruption law in the U.S., but the zeitgeist which affected that evolution. Essentially, not just the what, but the why as well. At times, the book is a bit dense and difficult to understand for the average reader, myself being one, but Teachout does her best to include as much explanation and reasoning as possible about not just what the laws and cases were about, but how they came about, and why they were decided or enforced the way that they were. All throughout the book, she quotes the cases themselves, judicial opinions, newspapers, politicians, lawyers, and anything else required to give a full picture of how views on corruption have ebbed and flowed over the history of the United States. The end of the book culminates in a lengthy review of Citizens United versus the FEC, and then suggestions as to what we can do in the future to help stop corruption, citing past and current examples. Personally speaking, my two most important takeaways from the book were the feelings of the Founding Fathers about corruption, and how we do, and should, view corruption. To speak to the first, Teachout quotes at length the Founding Fathers and those who inspired them, revealing their hatred for corruption, and their measure of a citizen's patriotism by how involved they were in civic and political life. It is clear to see that in their day, citizens were extremely active in politics and corruption was very low, all because they inspired people to care and believe in their power to enact change. Having read the book, the political apathy of today and the disconnect between the average citizen and the representative isn't just disappointing, it's embarrassing. This book has really impelled me to be more active in communicating with my representatives and taking part in activism. My second takeaway was how we view corruption, especially its intersection with free speech. Over time, a certain skittishness has pervaded our judicial system, and where a simple undeclared gift before could be a corrupt act worthy of impeachment, today $1 million contribution is simply an expression of political speech, and it is not considered corrupt unless it involves an explicit, provable quid pro quo agreement. The book makes an argument that this skittishness comes from a judicial nervousness about emotionalism. Just as we say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, one man's campaign contribution is another man's bribe. Is a campaign contribution a way to support a politician in what they plan to do, or is it a way to influence them to do something they otherwise wouldn't? What about a job offer to that politician? What about a nice dinner at a fancy restaurant? Are these expressions of gratitude from approving citizens, or attempts to secure a politician's loyalty for private interests? This gray area has been the difficulty for setting precedent, because an overreaction can indeed lead to suppressions of civil rights and free speech. Clearly, a lobbyist for big oil would be participating in corruption if they told a politician, "We will give you $5 million if you support legislation that will benefit our operations." But is it corruption if that same lobbyist says, "Hey, we love the work you're doing and we appreciate your support for our industry. Here's $5 million. The answer of courts today would be, no, it's not corruption, but the courts of yesteryear would argue the complete opposite. In our heart of hearts, we know that an offer like that is corrupt. Even if there is no explicit quid pro quo agreement, that politician is almost definitely going to be influenced. In essence, then, the book argues that we need to return to some form of emotional, err on the side of corruption view of these kinds of actions. Most importantly, Teachout suggests that anti-corruption efforts shouldn't come from the courts, but from the legislative branch. What the citizens of South Dakota got together to do was just that, pass a piece of legislation that was robust, encompassing, and straightforward. What Teachout refers to as a bright line rule, which is a law or bill that clearly prohibits or regulates a particular action in order to curb corruption. Another example of a bright line rule, which is covered in the book, is that which declared that only the U.S. government could print ballots for voting, and that they were to be marked in secret, among other things. Before then, partisan newspapers, companies, and trade unions would all print out their own unique and pre-marked ballots to be distributed to their adherents. Not using one when you were supposed to usually meant being fired. The Bright Line rule switch to the secret and uniform, publicly distributed ballots destroyed that corrupt practice immediately without compromising the average American's civil rights or the connection with the political process. If we had instead relied on a court case to try to establish a precedent on this issue, it likely would have been slow, difficult, and very possibly ineffective. Establishing a Bright Line law was the answer. The South Dakotans government failed them in implementing their Bright Line rule, but Teachout argues that their kind of civic action is exactly what we need in the United States to bring power back to the people. I took a lot away from this book, and it certainly has given me some direction and depth in understanding how we can proceed to tackle corruption in America. I strongly recommend this book to anyone active in politics because it is instrumental in the struggle to understand fully and combat political corruption.